everybody that came out tonight. I'm Kevin Peck. I'm one of the board members of the Historical Society. And I'm just glad Barry agreed to do this. He spoke at this meeting several years ago, and of course I didn't see that at that time. And we took the opportunity, I called him up, and we took the opportunity, because now we're going to put it on video, so it'll be saved on our website forever and ever, and also go on to the internet and YouTube and all that stuff. But anyhow, we all drive along, we all see the markers, but I have very limited knowledge about the Crown Point Road. So I'm really interested about what Barry's got to say, and I believe probably, it was like 6 or 8 years ago you were here?
7.
Bookends, right? Bookends. So I'm sure in that 7 years, new things have been found out about the Crown Point Road and shared. So without any hesitation, I welcome Barry.
Thank you. That was 7 years ago, and when I just started doing these presentations, I joined the Crown Point Road Association. Maybe 25 years ago, I live in Shrewsbury, not too far from the road, and like Ken and I got curious, and I met some people who knew a lot about the road. Jim Rowe in the back is our historian, and he came down today. And this is my distant cousin, Rebecca Hauger, who's going to run our. She's going to push the button so I don't have to put glasses on every time and figure out what I have to do. So they're both very knowledgeable, and I'm sure there's other people knowledgeable in here as well. So, and so we'll get started. I guess I think you generally know about the road. I guess we can go to the next slide, Rebecca. It was originally marked during the French and Indian War, specifically in 1759, 1760. And then it was used again during the American Revolution. There was a different version of it, and we'll talk about that. And so those were military uses of the road for a couple of years here and a couple of years there. But probably most important for Vermont is that it was the route, once it was cut and marked, it was the route used for many of our original settlers here in Vermont to come to Vermont. So that's why it's of interest to a lot of people, including myself. A little about the Crown Point Road Association. As we said, the road was originally built in 1759, and a bunch of people got together around the 200th anniversary saying, we ought to do something to celebrate and really dig into the history of this. The DAR did some history back in the day. There were other groups that looked at the history as well. But there had never really been a methodical study, and so those folks, a generation or more ago, got together to do that. And one of the things we do, we have an outings calendar every month. We get together and do an outing, either a hike or a car tour along the road. And we have a website, crownpointroad.org, so if you're interested in learning more, you can go there. This coming Sunday, we're going to be in Sudbury. We're going to be visiting a place known as the Vale House that some of you may have heard of. If you haven't, it's been called one of the best kept houses of the era in Vermont. We're going to meet at 1 and do a little tour of some markers there, and then we're going to get a tour of the Vale House at 3 o'clock on Sunday. So if you're interested, just Google Crown Point Road, and you can get more information about that meeting time and place, or talk to me later. Okay. So I think what we'll do is start by the big picture. We'll talk about the French and Indian War in particular. Then we talk about what happened in between the wars. Then the American Revolution came along, and then we'll try to focus specifically on Clarendon for the last part of the presentation. So that's kind of my outline of how we're going to go today. So this route is historic. We're very European and claimed he gave his name. At the same time, Henry Hudson came up to Manhattan Island and then sailed up the Hudson River as far as he could go, and so they were within maybe 20 or 30 miles of each other in 1609 as those explorations were going on. I always thought that was interesting, but more importantly, this was a route that Native Americans used for centuries. Again, you would come up the St. Lawrence, up the Lake Champlain. What you could then do is an easy hump little over to Lake George, then another little paddle, and that brings you to the Hudson River, and you can go all the way down. So there's that, and plus there's the Mohawk River that takes you up here to Lake Ontario. So those are routes that were used for centuries, millennia. What Europeans did in the 18th century is sort of an afterthought. And again, so to reinforce that, let's realize this was Abenaki territory for a long time. One of the things I've learned as I've learned more each year is that there's a settlement in Springfield, very near the Crown Point Road there, where it crossed the Connecticut River, and that farm goes back to 1100 AD, CE, about 400 years before Columbus was here. There were Native Americans working there and other places in Vermont, so let's not forget about them as we move on to talk about the French and the English. So, starting with the French came first, at least in terms of settlement of Lake Champlain. They worked their way up, as I said earlier, and on this slide you see a couple of dates when different places were settled, starting with Quebec, and then maybe 30 or 40 years later, Montreal. Then they worked their way up the Richelieu River, finally getting to St. Anne on Isle Motte in 1666. And then when we move into the 18th century, there were some additional settlements and forts that moved further down Lake Champlain that we'll see in a little bit. Next slide, I guess. Here were two of them. One of the French settlements was at Chimney Point, which is on the Vermont side of the lake, and I think most of you have been there and know where it is. There was a small fort there, and then a few years later, in 1734, the French built a very grand fort there. They called it Fort St. Frederick. The British took over that was the site of Crown Point, and that's what the English named it. But for the French, it was Fort St. Frederick. And during the King George's War and some of the wars in the 18th century, the French used that settlement to conduct Indian raids and raid the English settlements to the south. In the meantime, people were moving up the Connecticut River as well. Again, here's a little progression, starting in Springfield, and then at the southern end of Massachusetts, and up to Northfield, and then working your way up to Fort Dummer, and finally, around 1740, number 4 was settled in what we call present-day Charlestown. So the French were moving up one side, and the English were moving up the other side. And how do you get from here to there? It's tough in Vermont, as you all know. The slide on the left is one of the rivers, and I've highlighted there on the left the Otter Creek, which we're a stone's throw from, which again, the Native Americans and later on military groups came up the Otter Creek. On the other side, there was the Black River. And the Indians would use that, and then they would sort of hump over the mountains in the middle. I like this map because it sort of shows there's really the easiest place you're going to cross is right here. These are the mountains, but there is that gap, which is essentially Route 103 going from Clarendon down to Ludlow. And that's the path of least resistance, and that's the one the Americans took. It's the one the Native Americans took, the ones the French and the English took. So that's that picture. Again, by 1734, you had the French fort at Fort St. Frederick. You had on the Connecticut River side, the fort at number 4. And when hostilities arose, this was a fort that was designed to keep the incursions from going further south into Massachusetts. And this was the launching point. In those days, it was the French that were more densely settled here and had the upper hand in this neck of the woods. And then came the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as they called it in Europe. And that's when the Crown Point Road, as we know it, was cut and marked. By then, let's zoom out a little bit. Again, this is Lake Champlain. You can go up here to Lake George, which is, I think, 24 miles long or so. So again, you can bring your goods, portage, and then float down there to the bottom. There's then a carrying place that will take you over to the Hudson River, and then you can go from there down to Albany and beyond. So the English were settled here at Albany, Schenectady, and up to Fort Edward on the Hudson River. By this time, the French had built a fort at Ticonderoga, shown there. And so a lot of the battles in the French and Indian War took place in this theater rather than coming across Vermont. And that they would go back and forth, and I won't get into all that history. Eventually, in 1759, the British had an overwhelming force, and the French decided to retreat back to Canada. And so General Amherst at the time was in charge of the British forces. He was prepared for a big battle at Ticonderoga, but the French left, and they also abandoned their fort St. Frederick to the north. So Amherst got to there. And Amherst did really 3 things at that time. He had a big army, and he could have tried to chase the French, I suppose, up the Lake Champlain, but he decided to stop there and build a fort at Crown Point, a British fort. He sent some of his army out to the Lake Ontario to help over there with the battles that were going on over that way. Robert Rogers, some of you may know of him. He was sent with a force up to Canada to conduct raids up there, which were very devastating. And he also decided he would cut a road from Crown Point, which was going to be his base station for the invasion to Canada the following year, to make it easier to get both men and supplies to the fort. So that's how it came to be, and that was his decision in August of 1759. And the next slide will show you that Major Rogers said on August 8th, he had orders from General Amherst to send Captain Stark, John Stark, we all know him, of Battle of Bennington fame, among other things. And Amherst said, I sent 200 Rangers under the leadership of Stark to cut that road. And then it turns out we also have in his journal from a month later, on September 9th, he arrived with his party. They said he made the road, no mountains or swamps. He measured it at 77 miles, which is really pretty good. It's a pretty accurate description of the length even today. So once that was first done, then was getting to be the end of the campaign. In those days, you didn't fight in the winter. These troops had been conscripted from throughout New England. They all had to go home. So Amherst wasn't done, and he told Major John Hawks from Deerfield that we needed a road, and so what I'm going to do, what they were doing previously was sending them down the Hudson River to Albany and then across the Mass Pike, for want of a better word, back to New England. But he said rather than sending them south and then east, let's just cut the angle and send them through what we know as Vermont. And he said, clear it, widen it to at least 20 feet. If there are bridges necessary, lay them sufficiently strong to bear carriages. He wanted them to construct cattle pens every 15 miles. And John Small and armed regulars were going to guard them as they went down. So that was the order from General Amherst in 1759, and a lot of that was done. And we think about men crossing over that, but probably just as important for Amherst was food, beef on the hoof, cattle. And before the end of the day, he ordered, I think, from the House of Hancock, John Hancock's organization, 5 droves of cattle, 80 head each. And so when they got down there, the House of Hancock had the head ready to go, and they moved up to Crown Point to be meat for the troops. So that was a very important reason that Amherst wanted the road. So there are several journals. We know about some of these dates from journals. We've talked about Amherst Journal. This was one from somebody named Robert Webster, who was on that second cut. He was saying he left Crown Point. 11 days later, November 5th, they arrived at Otter Creek. Their bread was gone. They're very hungry. They kept going another 7 or 8 miles, then camped at Otter Creek. November 7th, snow and hail. And it looks like they spent about 3 days along the banks of the Otter Creek in these parts. And according to his work, they built a bridge for footmen to go over, and then continued on, finally moved on day 16 from Otter Creek, 3 miles, probably up to Shrewsbury, and then eventually a week after that got to the fort at number 4, and then were sent home for the winter. So that was 1759. The war was still going on in 1760. So what Amherst ordered was they wanted a New Hampshire regiment who was coming over to Crown Point to continue building the road under a gentleman named John Goff, a colonel at the time. That was organized over in Litchfield. It sort of worked its way west to Keene, and then worked its way up to the fort at number 4. And when they got there in early June, these 800 troops spent a month in Springfield and Charlestown across the river, helping to fortify that place in particular. They put in a ferry, they put in a blockhouse on the Springfield side to guard the ferry crossing. And that stood for many years and was used for Springfield town meetings and such once the war was over and Springfield began settled. They then worked their way up into across like through Cavendish and such. The original road went essentially Route 103. What Goff was trying to do was work his way a little bit north. What happened was he got about as far as the Black River Ponds, and he got a note from Amherst saying the French are getting ready to surrender. Stop building the road. Come join us. So we have notes from the journals at the time that they stopped building the road. They dropped down 2.5 miles and then came across Hawks Road the previous year. They went on and to Crown Point. Some of them went north to Canada, and by the end of the summer, August 28th, the French had surrendered, and the French and Indian War was over in these parts, so you didn't need a military route anymore. So one of the things that's always interested me a lot as a Vermonter is what happened between 1760, when the French and Indian War ended, and the next war started some 15 years later. Then in Wentworth, once he knew the war was over and these parts could maybe be settled, started issuing grants, and the New Yorkers did the same thing. And I think probably the next slide will show some of that. I think most of us know about Wentworth and the towns that he commissioned. Many of those towns have the same names today. But at the same time, the New York governor, at that point, Captain Law under Holden, was also trying to issue patents for land for settle in what we now call Vermont. So you had these conflicting claims, and they were fought over for a dozen or more years until it was fights were interrupted temporarily, at least by the American Revolution. And here in Clarendon, we have something else special. I mean, who knows what that is? You had, pardon? No, this is good. No. There was a guy named John Henry Lydius, who was a very interesting guy. He was very much involved with the Indians, the Native Americans back in the day. He had a trading post over on the Hudson River near Fort Edward. And he was a schemer, and he claimed to have a grant from the Mohawk Indians of the land along the Otter Creek. And so he, being wanting to make money like the rest of them, decided he made a map. He divided the land along the Otter Creek into different towns, and was trying to get people to buy his deeds and settle. This map on the left is one of the original ones that he was using to try to sell this land. The one on the right is a highway map of the area with the Otter Creek in blue. And again, if you went back there, I think you can see that I've highlighted Durham, which is Clarendon, right? And in fact, many people came here with deeds from Lydius, so from Rhode Island and elsewhere. Again, you're all from Clarendon, so you know that history probably better than I do. We can talk about it later if you want. So, okay, fast forward 15 years, the American Revolution began, and so we had another war, so we had a need for a military road again. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And the first year, 250 years ago, right, 1775, a whole lot of stuff happened, starting with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Ethan Allen heard about that, Benedict Arnold heard about that. They were excited to go up and capture Fort Ticonderoga, and in fact they did. We've had events celebrating that adventure and capture all year. Bunker Hill forced the British to reckon what was going on. There was a Montgomery expedition. The colonists moved north, trying to chase the British into Canada and perhaps capture it. One of the great Green Mountain Boys, I remember, Baker, was killed in that conflict. Ethan Allen was captured and spent most of the American Revolution in custody. The attack didn't work in any event. The British and their French patriots held on. That was 1775. So the war was going to go on another year, and what the Americans at that point decided they would do, rather than stand their ground at Crown Point, which was 15 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga, they decided instead to stand their ground and make their stand at Ticonderoga on the New York side, and of course the Mount Independence, as it came to be known, on the Vermont side. Many of you, I hope all of you have been there. So they built this up in 1776, and since that was now the major area that needed the supplies, there were variations made. It was ordered that there be a road built through Hubbardton and Rutland, rather than going further north, as we'll see on the next slide. There it is. So here's the red line on this map was the original Crown Point road up to Crown Point, 15 miles north of Mount Independence and Ticonderoga. Initially, when that war started, the troops sort of went up the Crown Point road and then used what is called the tie bridge. They sort of went due west from there and used the main road as far as it was. In 1776, the general said, no, we want to build a more direct route through Hubbardton, which is this green route you see here. So that was the route that was used during the American Revolution to supply Crown Point, not Crown Point, excuse me, but Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. And I think the next slide shows a little bit about this in a little more detail in our area. This is Rutland here, and this is, well, here's Alphresia, here's Clarendon. The original road, we're quite sure, and we'll talk more about this later, crossed Otter Creek down here in Clarendon, and then ran east. And nobody was living here to speak of in 1760. By 1775, there were settlers in Clarendon and elsewhere. There was an inn here, Smith Inn, that later became Moulton Tavern, that was here for a long time. And there was also a fort established up in Rutland, so rather than cross the river here in Clarendon, the main traffic then went to the Fort Rutland, in Rutland, and then from there headed west to go toward Ticonderoga Road. And here's an excerpt from one of the Rutland Historical Society magazines. These are artist depictions. The first fort in 1775 was Fort Rutland. That was essentially on Main Street at the junction of West Street. There's a marker there that the DAR put in at some point, and that was the headquarters for a time. A few years later, they constructed Fort Ranger, which is over in center Rutland on the banks of the Otter Creek there, and that guarded the crossing of the Otter Creek that was going on at that point in the war. The third year, we all know about that the British were deterred in 1776. They came down and saw the fortification at Mount Independence and decided to go back for another year. But they came back in 1777. At that point, the American forces said, we're overwhelmed, we're leaving. So they evacuated. Some of the troops came through Hubbardton. There was a battle there on July 7th of 1777 that we just reenacted. And the word went out. Eventually there was a battle down in Bennington on August 16th, and a month after that, or a couple of weeks after that, Burgoyne was slowed down at Saratoga and eventually surrendered his army to the American forces. So that was those 3 years. There's more, but again, I'm trying to be very quick here. So since then, over the centuries, people have been putting up markers, trying to remember various things that went on the Crown Point Road. One of the earliest ones, actually, although it wasn't directly, I don't know if they were trying to honor the Crown Point Road, they were trying to honor Joseph White, who was right here, a stone's throw away from us right now, which was put there in 1808. In 1860, an Elias Hall put this marker at Camp Stony Creek, which is up in Shoreham, in honor of his grandfather who traveled the road during the French and Indian War. And then the DAR at the beginning of the 20th century started placing markers. They placed 2 here in Clarendon in 1914 that we can talk about. And then later in this 20th century, as I talked about earlier, the Crown Point Road Association became involved and started placing their own markers in addition to the other ones. So that's sort of the overview of the markers. What do we have here? We have some markers maybe. There are 4 markers that the Crown Point Road Association has in its markers book here in Clarendon. Probably the most famous one is the Joseph White Memorial that I just talked about in the field across the way. And I'm sure you all know about that. We can talk more about that later if you want. Next slide would show this marker, which is at the site of the Bowman Tavern, Pierce's Corner. Again, I think all of you know where that is. Bowman was married the daughter of Joseph Smith, who originally owned the inn, and then ran it for 51 years. Some of you may remember it before it burned in 1959. Some of you remember that, I guess. Another marker was erected the same day, just another stone's throw that way, just to the east of here on the old Route 7. And and the DAR. This was a dedication pamphlet, which you have in your records, and this is copied from that. The speaker was it says here it was Mrs. Lowell Powers, I guess it is, but she was Mary Cavanaugh Powers, who lived down in the Flats, who I guess was quite the woman. Did any of you happen to know Mary Cavanaugh Powers back in the day? I think she died in 1940, so you'd have to be pretty old, but maybe you've heard stories about her. She married Powers of, the Powers Bridge fame. And they got the children all together and sang songs and dedicated the marker. It has the date of June 14th, which is Flag Day, and the DAR traditionally dedicates the markers on Flag Day in different years. So that's that marker. And then a fourth one was put up by the Crown Point Road Association more recently. This is over on, I guess, the Creek Road, near, what's the name of that?
Horton.
Road, yeah. This was actually put up by the Crown Point Road Association. We were finally involved by then. We had a nice dedication ceremony in 2002. We got some of Whitcomb's Rangers here. I thought maybe anybody here of Whitcomb's Rangers. They came and participated in that. The marker was dedicated to one of our historians, Al Ransom, who had just died, and who was a tremendous researcher. He surveyed the old way. He had chains and links and would go out there and try to measure. He got notes from Will Cockburn, who was the New York surveyor. And so he would read those notes and try to go out and figure out where things crossed. And he also did a lot of research. One of the maps over there, which I won't hand up right now, is one he discovered in the New York State Archives by Will Cockburn, which goes back to 1767, I believe, which was when nobody was settled here. And when he was doing a surveying and came across the Crown Point Road, he would make note of that. And the map shows the crossing here in Clarendon. There was many people, the DAR used to operate on the assumption that it went up through Rutland, which it did in the American Revolution, but even before that, in the French and Indian War, it crossed here. It also shows that it passed below Lake Nineveh. In the American Revolution, it went up to Plymouth and came over the north end of the ponds over there, the Latin ponds. That map, which is of the period, helped to establish the route in the French and Indian War. Some of you know about Social Borough. I'm assuming that was a town that New York was hoped to sell land to and get people to settle it. The southern part of it was in Clarendon. This is the Clarendon-Rutland line here. So this map of Social Borough, which is 1771, shows some of the settlers that were in Clarendon and just over the border in Rutland town back in 1771. Again, I have a copy of it over here if you want to take a look at it closer. So this is the Cold River here, and again, you can take a closer look if you won't care to later. Another interesting piece of research is we try to go back to, my thought is to go back to what was written in 1770, 1760, because that's the best, in my judgment, one of the best ways to find out what was going on and where. There was an almanac published in Boston in 1773, which actually started in Boston and went all the way to Montreal. I said, well, you could take a coach if you want all the way and stop along the way. I don't know, it would have been pretty primitive, but it actually noted some places along the Crown Point Road, and some of these we know about. In Walpole, there was Bellows who was there, and there were a couple of folks in Charlestown, and they had Hastings and Walker. There was a Knott's Ferry in Springfield, ferry across the Springfield by the name of Stevens. There was one by Spafford and Weathersfield. Payne Tavern, Coffeen Tavern, and Cavendish are well known. And interestingly enough, there was, they said when you got to Otter Creek, you could stay at Buttons. And then it went on, there was a Meads Tavern we know about in Pittsburgh, we know about Waters Tavern in, Meads in Rutland, Pittsburgh, Waters Tavern, and then it's going all along the way. So this has always fascinated me, and that's one of the things I've tried to learn a little bit more about. And when I've done this research, well, I really, your organization deserves compliments. When I go on, I've gone on to Google things. This time, as I was doing my work here for this presentation, anytime I put in something asking about something in Clarendon, I get referred to the website of the Clarendon Historical Society. So you folks have done a great job. I've talked to a lot of organizations and historical societies, but in terms of getting this stuff digitized and out there for everyone to be able to use, you did a great job. And so the next slide shows, this is an old map that I guess Von Hance provided. It says Clarendon before 1776. Doesn't give the provenance of it, unfortunately. But it does show down here, this is the Buttons, and there was a little arrow next to it, and the arrow meant there was an inn there. And the other circled on this was the Sprague residence, and I think you folks have determined that the Spragues were probably the first ones to settle in Clarendon, and the Buttons soon thereafter. So I guess by that point, there were a couple of quotes that I'd like to think about when I do my Crown Point Road research. One of them is when they started doing this back in the 1950s, they reported, well, everybody we talked to knows where the Crown Point Road went, and they all say it went somewhere else. Nobody could agree. They all knew where it went, but nobody had the same idea. And the other quote, that's apropos here, was by Al Ransom. Glasses on. Is that the Crown Point Road was not a static, fixed in one place road, but more like the creek, which it often followed. It was continually changing and evolving into a new road, with new parts being added and some old parts being abandoned as a better route was discovered. The addition of a new bridge or a new tavern could be enough to change the location. And in my judgment, that's what happened here. We know that the original crossing back in when John Stark did it was up here, but 1973, if you can go back, is it was down here, which is, I guess, below the Mill River, but I guess you could ford the Mill River easily enough there. If there was a place to stay there, you'd stay where you were welcome rather than camping out or whatever you did. So I know when I was doing my research, I different articles, especially older ones, say different things about where the Crown Point Road went. The town of West Rutland's website said it went by Buttons Tavern, which I guess it did in 1773, but not in 1760 or even 1775. Things change, and kudos to your organization for this research that helped me understand better what was going on here. So a few other thoughts about fords and bridges. We can maybe open it up for discussion. The original way to get across rivers, of course, were by fords, and probably the best, at least north of here, the best way to get across Otter Creek is at Pitt's Ford, which was that probably had a different name when the French were using it, but when the British came along, they renamed everything for British generals, and Pitt was the Secretary of War then, I believe. And one of the things that Elias Hall said about his grandfather going back was that he came down and then crossed over at Pitt's Ford and came down. And maybe he did, but that wasn't the route that its start mark in 1759. It was probably used by the Native Americans, it was probably used by the French, and it was probably well worn, so very well could have come that way. I also learned when I was over in Springfield doing one of these presentations recently, is that it was possible back in the day, before the Connecticut River was dammed up, to actually ford the Connecticut River just a little north of Springfield. That kind of amazed me, but I looked at some old hydrology records, and actually you could. So fords from the first may go across, and that may have been influenced by the Native Americans were there and others. So those are the fords, and then the other thing to talk about is bridges. We know, because at least according to the journals from 1759, we know that when Waite came down, not Waite, but Hawks, they built a bridge here, spent 3 or 4 days building a bridge in 1759. It was a decade later before the first settlers came here. Would that bridge still have been there? We know in 1775, 76, they said build a bridge up over the Otter Creek up around Meads Falls, which they did. But what was the first bridge here? There was an incident in 1777, we talked earlier about how the British came down and captured Fort Ticonderoga. The Patriots fled to the south and west, and a couple of things happened. Number one, the Vermont legislature was meeting in Windsor at the time, and it commissioned an army, or excuse me, a regiment. It commissioned a regiment of Rangers, the Council of Safety did, under a guy named Samuel Herrick. At the same time, General Burgoyne, the British general, was sending out to people, if you want protection, come to Whitehall, come to Skenesborough, let us know you're on our side, on the loyalist side, and we'll give you safe passage. And there was some folks by the name of Irish that had settled in Danby, and the original Irish was the Jesse Irish, and he had 7 sons. One of them at that time was living up in Teignmouth, just across the border from here. And the forces, the militia, the Vermont militia, went there and ended up killing Irish in a bit of a skirmish. But the wife, and the thing that was interest to me of that was when they asked his wife to tell what happened, she said one of the soldiers came in, I guess not dressed as a soldier, one of Irish's oldest neighbors, came in and he asked the way to Durham Bridge. And can you take me down to Durham Bridge? And Irish said, no, I won't take you, go that way. But that got me thinking, apparently, and that was July of 1777, there was a bridge across Otter Creek here in Clarendon. So I don't know what you thought. I talked about that when I was here 7 years ago, and I'm talking about it again. That's always been of interest to me. I think there's a ford down in the flats where the bridge is, near where the bridge is now. Where was Durham Bridge? And again, thanks to your wonderful historical society and what you have online, what I learned is that I found an article that you folks had posted that said right up here on Alphresia Road, there was a bridge there at least in 1780. So I'm guessing that was probably very likely, it seems to me, that bridge was there in 1777 and was Durham Bridge. Whether that was the same location or the same bridge that was there and built in 1759, I kind of doubt it. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that. But, so that's something again, I learned from your website and offer it for your consideration. And I think we're probably just about done, aren't we?
Yep.
pretty much all actually got one more slide. Gotta get that one more slide, because that's a beautiful picture. So that's what I've got for you. I'd be interested to hear from you, answer any questions you might have.
Barry, I have a question. The old original Crown Point Road, you mentioned that they had cattle pens or something every 15 miles.
Yes.
Have they been identified, every one of them?
There's been work going on that, and again, I mentioned Al Ransom earlier. That was one of his obsessions. Jim Rowe is here, he can probably talk more about this as well. Several of them have. We think one of them was in Shrewsbury, on, I guess what they call the Gainer Road, which is now thrown up. Essentially, this work about where the Long Trail is. There was a site there, and I guess there's a way that you can figure out where those were, and and Al would go by and say, well, let's see, 15 miles, where is it? And that was one that he suspected was one. There's also on the way to Proctor, on I guess that's West Proctor Road, on the west side of the creek, which is where the Crown Point Road ran. There's also a site there that's kind of on a hill, and the thought was maybe that was there. They could put the cattle up there to keep the wolves away and things of that sort. And Jim Rowe, you're familiar with some other ones that we've been
Well, in Sudbury, on Spooner Hill, there was supposed to have been another one there. And anytime we've been there to look at, looking for any remnants of anything, it's been pretty heavily quarried, so a lot of stuff is destroyed there. Then the most southern one would have been in Cavendish, and Al and I had been there a number of years ago, and we found some piles of stone where they might have laid some logs to make a little fenced-in area to hold some cattle. And they always seem to put them up on a hill where we can have this kind of a defensive position to maintain.
That's one of those clues that historians like Jim and Al were looking into. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes?
I live on the road where Buttons lived.
Yeah.
And so Otter Creek runs right behind my property, and on going through my property, there used to be a place to run your cattle.
Yeah.
It's written right into the deed.
Okay.
And there was a footbridge. But what I discovered in bumming around near the creek was there was apparently an older bridge a little ways up the river towards Wallingford direction.
Yeah.
And like stones, and you could tell, something had been there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there've been a lot of iterations of 250 years.
Yeah.
And if in fact they were staying at Buttons, I suppose they could have crossed over Mill River again and crossed in the flats there where I described. I know there was a ford, but maybe there was a ford right down there and they didn't have to.
And a little bit north of Ellen's house, there's a couple other remnants of footings.
Yeah.
Very, just nothing fancy footings, but very crude footings. Say south of Walker Mountain Road, we've identified at least two of them there. There's over here, this was Social Borough, so the Alphresia Bridge, that would have always been in Social Borough versus Durham.
Okay.
Because the line Durham was south of, here.
But I think that a lot of people settled here, the Durhamites, I think, settled here.
Yeah, this is where
Social
more people were settling.
Yeah.
The Durham Bridge, especially if you're someone from Tinmouth, is going to show them. I'm thinking of maybe more down the Clarendon Flats area.
Yeah, well, that would make sense, but
there are two bridges in, near Ellen's house, another two a little bit north of there, but if you're still south of Walker Mountain Road, on Creek Road.
Barb and I have kayaked that whole route back and forth many times, and you can see a lot of stuff. That's one of the interesting things about this. We don't know an answer, but we can speculate. phone, I think. Anything else? Yes, Matt?
The cattle pen site in Shrewsbury, I had a deer camp right next to it for many years.
Okay.
And there's a little swamp right there, and I got a picture of the Crown Point marker saying 1759 cattle pen site with an arrow pointing towards it.
Yeah.
And I was just getting into metal detecting, I found my first musket ball there. A 75 caliber, I still have it.
Well, there you
And the
go.
thing is pure white.
Well, there you go. And that's the kind of evidence. That sign has been missing for about 2 years now. I did my annual walk up there, and it was gone, so.
Yeah, it's right off Gainer Road.
Yeah, no, it used to be, but it's, the last time I walked up there, I couldn't find it. It was gone. I don't know if somebody.
Well, I think you can drive up that road now, perhaps, somebody.
Yes, you can, yeah, you can. But yeah, there was that sign that our organization put there. That's interesting that you know, not only you knew where it was, but you found the musket ball there.
Yeah, if you want it, you can have it to help. Everything for sale, I find, metal detecting. I'll give it to you if you want.
Nice, thank you.
You know, on that note, when we did the walkthrough for the Crown Point Road in 2009, we're walking the Creek Road, and this woman comes out of a farm, and she was waiting for us because some of us were dressed for the period, and it had been in the newspaper, and she had a cannonball. It was so exciting. She was so excited to see us, but that's more indication that the road went through here.
And I think Harold Billings' place, there were some things of that sort, musket balls, cannonball.
That brings up another question that I have about the Crown Point Road that runs through Clarendon. Are there any documents that record cannons being pulled through? I mean, if you find a cannonball, you would assume there's cannons that would have traveled from Fort Number 4 up. Is there any record of that?
Oh, well, I guess one of the things I always, when in 1775, when Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ty and then Crown Point, there were all sorts of cannon there that they took, and they brought those down to Boston, Dorchester Heights, and eventually that caused the British to leave the Bay because they hadn't been beat on. I used to think they went through on the Crown Point Road, but they didn't. My best judgment is that at least they came down, took that earlier route. I told you they floated them down George and then over to Hudson and over to Albany and then came through Massachusetts that way. Now there were some other people have asked that question, and I know there were some operations to be conducted up in Canada, and I did see a suggestion that maybe a cannon or two might have gone up the road the other way during that tenure. I think one of the Button, I think I read a history of one of the Button grandfathers maybe that said she remembered cannon going by her place.
That's in the history of
Well,
Wallingford.
there you go, yes. So, and so it's, I mean, it could have happened that way, or it could be, people putting two together and coming up with, making assumptions that, but yeah, that is interesting, and if I can find more evidence, I'd love to do it, but not yet.
It's interesting, we had the slide, the Buttons arriving, he had 67 or 68.
Yeah.
Last July, when I was working down the Button Cemetery, I pulled a stone up that was broken
Yeah.
and repaired it. And the inscription on the bottom, I was reading it, and I ended up calling Bob, and Bob came down, so waving red meat in front of the dog. He came down pretty quick. And it was her, and the inscription was, she was the second white woman to come to the town of Durham in 1768.
And that's been digitized and is on your website, so.
It is,
We're
yeah.
we're still, there's all this stuff to be learned, we can all learn more. Well, yes, one more
one question if I may.
Sure.
Is there a current map of the Crown Point roads superimposed on a map of the current road system?
Well, I have over here, the one that I
Okay, I
did,
didn't see that here.
and it's not, you say you had or hadn't seen that.
No, I haven't walked over to see
Okay,
it.
so that's one I've done, and we do have a marker book, which is available for sale, although I didn't bring copies. And then they do also have sort of fair maps by section, showing current roads, and I think the maps from
You know,
65.
much as the gentleman found a 75 caliber musket ball
Yeah.
on his land, I've found musket balls on my land, and I live across on the North Shrewsbury Road.
Sure.
Up on a hill.
Yeah, well, yeah.
You know, another 75 caliber musket ball.
No, Phil Mandelator's found all sorts of balls on the Crown Point Road in Brandon Way, so they're,
Over 100.
yeah.
And last week I found 77 of those little buckshot balls in the same spot.
Which probably indicates that somebody camped there.
And they dropped their leather pouch, and the pouch disintegrated over the years and left the, yeah.
That's another type of research that, it's great, so. Well, anyway, I'm gonna stick around, but why don't we adjourn this part of it and take a look at the maps, and I'm here happy to answer questions, and Rebecca and Jim, you're here as well, they know more than I do about some of this, so go ahead. Thanks again for having me.